Okay, thank you very much, Joe. Thanks for getting me up here. So can you write in the chat, just tell me you can see the screen. Type C screen into the chat for me, just so I know that you can see my slides. I'm not going to be just talking to air. All right, brilliant. Thank you, everyone. That's great. So thank you for coming to join us today. My name is Joshua Balsters. It feels like a long time ago now. I used to be a lecturer in the psychology department at Royal Holloway. Well, I guess before that, I was just going from postdoc to postdoc, and I spent quite a few years doing almost every kind of research, really. I've done attention studies, memory, rule-based learning, social decision-making, value-based decision-making, some brain imaging stuff. And I think that's why Joe wanted me to come online to talk a bit about this, or trying to condense all of that research experience to give you some hints and tips about taking work online. And some of the things that we've seen, especially over the last year with guerrilla users, what are some of the best ways to take your research online? So essentially, we're going to start off just by kind of introducing this question. Why should you go online? What are the benefits to you? We're going to talk a little bit about the challenges and some of the rebuttals, the things that Pesky Reviewer 2 is going to probably say to you. We're going to talk about some of the practical considerations, some of the really useful tips and tricks that we've been picking up at Guerrilla and things we've picked up in other places to try and help you out and help you create the best online experiment possible. And I'm going to go through some inspirational stories as well, some really brilliant examples of some of the kinds of just astounding research you can take and you can take online. So I think in 3 simple words, why should you take your research online? Speed, scale, and reach. I think these are really the 3 pillars of online research. The speed with which you can collect data when you're working online, I still find this absolutely fascinating. And it's just incredible thinking about the months I used to spend doing online research, doing non-online research, doing lab-based research, in fact. Now with online research, I grab a sandwich and by the time I get back, my experiment's done. I think, it's absolutely incredible the speed that you can collect data with online. And the important thing about that speed, and it's something I think for everyone, no matter what stage in your career you are, whether you decide to stay in academia or leave, that speed allows you to buy back your time. And that's probably one of the most important assets we have, our time. So in my personal opinion, you don't really learn that much. After having 10 participants through the lab, and you've probably refined your spiel, you're a bit better at explaining your experiments to people. After that, you're not really gaining anything in terms of skills. It's just time that's being consumed. Whereas with online research, you're buying back that time because it is just done for you in a matter of hours rather than months. And that means you've got free time on your hands and you can decide what to do. You can decide whether it's better to learn a new analysis type skill, read around your subject more, get around to writing a paper. Hell, just have a glass of wine and watch something nice on Netflix and take a bit of time for you. Buying back your time is probably the most important thing, I think, about moving your research online. But on top of that, we also have the scale of online research, which also isn't with lab-based research, there's this linear relationship. If I want twice as many subjects, it takes twice as long to collect. You don't have that with online research. If I want to go 2 times, 3 times, 10 times as many participants, it's usually a small fraction of time that you are adding onto your data collection rather than doubling, tripling, exponentially increasing your time to collect data. And with that, you also get reach. And reach works in 2 ways, which is quite interesting. First of all, it allows you to find participants who you wouldn't normally get to work with. I found this when I was in Ireland. I did a lot of aging research, and the elderly individuals were absolutely wonderful. But I think after a while, you realize the elderly individuals who are able to make the efforts to come into a laboratory and do research with you, these aren't perhaps the typical elderly individuals. You're missing out, for example, on a lot of people who might have different kinds of physical pain, hip problems, knee problems. These people can't come into the lab and see you. You're missing out on researching with them. So this kind of online research means that you can send research into people's homes. So it means you get a more representative sample. And it means, kind of in line with the idea of scale, you're increasing the number of participants in what are sometimes quite difficult to acquire populations. This is great, obviously, in terms of reproducibility. And at the BeOnline conference, well, this conference, obviously, we've got a great session tomorrow afternoon, kind of wrapping everything up with Joe and a number of other wonderful speakers to talk about reproducibility 2.0. The other thing as well is we have just before that, Jonathan Say, who's going to be doing a symposium about motor control online. And in previous chats, he's told us that the ability to take his work online has opened up a whole new participant pool, and we're increasing the sample sizes in that participant pool. So I think, these are some of the key benefits for online research. And online research was on the rise anyway, pre-pandemic. The pandemic, from what we hear from our clients, it's been the push they needed to get online and start doing online research. And most likely what's going to happen is that online research is here to stay. And what we're hearing is that most people are going to do a combination of lab-based and online studies now on. So it's important that you get familiar with online research as it becomes increasingly commonplace for all the reasons that I've just mentioned. For all the kind of supervisors out there, this quote means a lot to me. Being able to test online means my research doesn't grind to a halt. This was especially important for my PhD students. I did not want their research and mental health to suffer because they couldn't carry out their studies. Now, I was in this situation with my own PhD student. She had a magnificent MRI study, and the day she was about to start testing, we had to shut the whole MRI scanner down. I think this happened to a lot of people. I'm sure there's a lot of sympathy out there for people that have been in this situation. Online research, I think, is going to help people, like I said, buy back their time, and it's going to increase the well-being of a lot of people doing research. And for me, that's really the most important thing, buying back your time with online research. I'm going to jump now to talk a little bit about the challenges of online research, the kind of things that the critiques that you often hear about online research. And this is David Ogilvy, who you might not have heard of. Apparently, he was the inspiration for Don Draper in Mad Men. He was quite a famous market researcher, and he has this very famous quote that the trouble with market research is that people don't think how they feel, they don't say what they think, and they don't do what they say. And I think this is a great quote for all of behavioral science, to be honest. But I think a lot of people have always considered online research to just be survey-based. And this is their kind of critique, to say, well, I need to do something that gets at some of the implicit behavioral parameters, things that go beyond what people say, go beyond your traditional survey-based research. How can I do that online? Well, now we know there are increasingly a number of platforms that are making that available and allowing you to create absolutely wonderful experiments online, which are incredibly complex and sophisticated. And I'm going to talk about just a couple of these at the end of this talk. Now, yeah, once we move online, you might have to think, oh God, do I need to learn another programming language? If you were like me, I trained in MATLAB, which is becoming pretty much a defunct language. I started learning Python and R, and then online research came, and I just thought, oh my God, now I need to learn HTML and JavaScript. Really? Well, I had basically, you don't have to anymore. There are a lot of amazing tools out there which allow you to do a lot of things just using a standard graphical user interface, nice drag and drop interface. In fact, if you want to find out more about that, I wrote a blog piece for Gorilla a couple of weeks ago. It's a very cathartic blog piece, I have to say. I got a lot of demons out talking about those evil red lines of code. But you can have a read of that. Essentially, the point is you don't need to worry about learning a new programming language. You can go out there and you can create wonderful experiments without needing a line of code. Now, I think the biggest challenge for online research is this idea that online research is inherently flawed and that participants are going to behave badly. They're not going to give you the kind of data quality that you get in the lab. And I would challenge this assertion. I don't think it's necessarily true. In fact, Joe Evershed wrote a really nice blog piece previously about the illusion of control. And we talk about these kind of critiques of online research, this idea that, oh, well, obviously they're going to be just pressing the spacebar with one hand while playing Fortnite with the other hand, or watching the England game later on, for example. And I don't think that's a fair criticism. I think when we think about lab-based testing, we paint it as this picture of purity when it really is not. For example, I'm sure every now and again we've drifted off in the middle of an experiment in a lab and our mind has gone off to wandering, especially if it's a bit of a boring experiment. Now, as well, you can see, in terms of quality, well, there are obviously distractions in the lab. People go in with their phones, they go in with their smartwatches on, they'll get buzzes, there'll be other distractions. So the point that I would like to raise, I would first of all, like to challenge this idea that the lab is somehow the ground truth of behavior. I think in a lot of ways you can argue it is an unrealistic situation. And again, thinking later on, I think there's going to be some chat about this in the Reproducibility 2.0 session tomorrow. This idea that lab-based testing may not be the ground truth we think it is. That said, I would also say that if you design good experiments, then you can get just as good data quality out of an online study that you would get in the lab. And I'm going to show you just a handful of examples that prove that is the case. So in terms of these are what we think about our 7-step guide for successfully doing an online study. These are just some suggestions and some a way of thinking about building your next online experiment and the things that you should consider. First of all, consider your study. What is the best study to get started with, especially if you are new to online research? What's the best study to take? I think personally, I would say start with something that you're familiar with. I think it's the best way to get started on this. Rather than taking a whole brand new topic, as well as taking on a whole brand new domain with online research, why don't you start saying, well, this is what I did in the lab, so let's try it online. It's always great to have these kind of sanity checks, little things that can be built into your study that will help you feel confident about what you are doing. So when you're selecting a study, I'd recommend trying to do that. The next thing we're going to talk about is building the study. What do you need to build your experiment? And these are a couple of things to bear in mind, I think, some key things related to online research. The first thing I would say is you need clear and concise instructions. I can't stress this enough. What I would say is that you're not confined anymore to kind of lab-based design, where you typically would have an A4 sheet of paper with your instructions written all over it, and you would say, oh, read this, and if you have any questions, let me know. First of all, you're not there to answer any questions, but also it's a very boring and formal way of doing things. As you've moved online, why not change, essentially? We can do things in any format now, and one of the things I really enjoy as part of my time at Gorilla is Gorilla Academy. And one of the things I have in there is a social influence task, a real fun thing that I made where we see the influence Rotten Tomatoes has on your behavior. And within that, what I decided to do, rather than having a lengthy block of text to explain the paradigm, I just made a video of me doing the task and talking through the trial. I think sometimes that's just the easiest way of doing things. So don't feel constrained by the way you used to do things in the lab. You can adapt and do lots of crazy new things with online research. And in fact, this YouTube link, which we're going to make accessible later on, this links to Simone's research. And Simone is actually going to be speaking next after me as the first speaker in the Buffet of Research section. So definitely you want to listen to her because she's got so many top tips. It's not even real. And yeah, her videos are amazing. She talks through how to take an incredibly complicated eye tracking study, and she has the most beautiful detailed instructions. That's the kind of thing that you want to be going for. So next thing I want to talk about is kind of keep it short. And this is something that we recommend with our online studies. If you can, and it's not always possible, but if you can, try to keep your studies to 5 to 10 minutes. That's going to really help. The other thing as well is to use progress bars. And this really helps a lot with attrition. If a participant can see how many trials along they are, then they're going to be able to say, I've only got a small section left. I should keep going. And rather than somebody who's done 95% of the study dropping out the last 5%. So I think that's going to be, incredibly helpful. And if you can build in breaks for a lot of reasons with online studies, if people know that they're going to get a break every 5 minutes, that's incredibly helpful for them. So that's something to bear in mind as well. If you can, include vigilance checks. So with Guerrilla Academy, again, this was a different one. This was the attention study. And it was a beautiful experiment by Polly Dalton looking at dichotic listening. And you hear the voices all around your head. It's like you're in the room. But the point that it only works if you have headphones in. So if somebody just has their speakers on, it won't work. So in order to kind of get around that and make sure people were listening with their headphones, I had a little vigilance check. Just said, can you hear this noise on the left or the right? And you wouldn't be able to tell from your speakers, but in the headphones, it's obvious. So have these little vigilance checks built into your study. What you'll see when I went to analyze the data is that by excluding individuals that failed the vigilance check, I increased my effect size. And I was able to actually pre-register those exclusion criteria because of piloting, which is what I'm actually going to come to in a second. Now, the next thing as well is this debrief questionnaire. So just ask people. I can't recommend that highly enough. If you've got participants doing your experiments, you can just have a form at the end that says, was there anything unusual? Was there anything you think could be explained better? Did this make sense? Did you enjoy it? Ask people for their feedback. It's just so simple, and it will give you so much information before you put your experiments online. Having a debrief questionnaire is incredibly helpful, especially when you're piloting. Before I get onto piloting, I just want to briefly mention ethics. Probably before, in fact, you get into all the effort of building your experiments. When you're thinking about your online study, you need to think about the ethics and thinking specifically about the platform. Does your platform conform to information security rules in your department? Does it conform to things like GDPR? Now, these are horrible, boring things that nobody really wants to have to deal with. So if you can, find a platform that has that information and says, don't worry, we've got this. Your ethics panels will probably ask you about it. So look into it, definitely. Now, I want to talk about piloting, and Emily Breeze gave the most wonderful talk at last year's BeOnline, all about piloting and how crucial it is to do piloting in your experiments. Now, there are a couple reasons for this. I think one of those reasons is that typically the participants we get in the psychology department at universities, they're psychology students at the university, or they're people who are experienced participants. So these experienced participants are essentially, they're going to be able to fill in the gaps if you don't have good enough instructions. But when you move online, this probably isn't the case. So you're not around to answer their questions. So please make sure to pilot with people and figure these things out. And yeah, Emily gives these wonderful examples from the trail making test, a kind of a fundamental of neuropsychology, where you have to either draw the lines between 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or the alternating 1A, 2B, 3C. And she talks about all the kind of issues she had and some of the crazy answers people came up with that helped her refine her instructions. Emily goes through this much better than I do, and she actually has a wonderful framework in her video. So I strongly recommend having a look at that. But don't think about piloting just for your instructions. Piloting is also good to look at your data output. Is your data output correct? Do you have all the information you need to analyze your data? Because the speed of online testing is absolutely wonderful. But the flip side of that is that if you collect all your data so quickly, then unfortunately, if something's wrong, you've just had to pay 100 or 500 people for their time when you've got an error. And that's not your participants' fault, that's on you. So make sure before you do your big reveal, your big release, that you check your data output is correct, that it has everything you need. And like I've mentioned just before that, you can use this piloting for exclusion criteria. So you can figure out what, oh, anyone who seems to think this, they weren't doing it right. So I can say that is an exclusion criteria. I can't stress it enough. Pilot, pilot, pilot. It's probably the most important thing you can do. And you do need to pilot more in this with online testing than you would need to with lab-based testing. I've already talked a little bit there about pre-registration. Obviously, piloting is a great way to pre-register any exclusion criteria that you might have in your experiments. And I've seen something floating around Twitter recently. I'm not sure if it's a preprint or a published paper, but essentially they compared pre-registered reports with non-registered equivalents. And they tend to find that in terms of markers of creativity, everything is stable. So all those concerns before about pre-registration was going to ruin discovery science, they don't seem to be valid. But they did find that the statistical quality and methodological rigor of pre-registered work was greater than the non-registered controls. So I think pre-registration is going to be really important. And again, just to give another plug for that Reproducibility 2.0 session, we're going to get into all of these kinds of questions and details at the end of BeOnline. And then that's it. It's time to collect your data, time to analyze your data. And there are some wonderful advances coming up as well, things like R Markdown, which mean that you're going to be able to create these beautiful curated scripts that are able to keep track of all your analysis and do all of your, basically work with the raw data to produce a beautiful, clear transcript at the end of your results. There's a lot of stuff coming through, and a little sneak hint, there might be something coming up in the future, long in the future, with Gorilla and data, but that's something probably for our next BeOnline conference. What are the things you want to consider in your experimental platform? Well, does my experimental platform do what I need it to do? That's probably the most crucial question. So it's worth laying out. What do you need it to do? What do you need your experimental platform to do? Most people are thinking probably task builder. I need some kind of way of presenting images, responses, etc. But you probably want a survey as well. Even if you're not doing survey-based research, the ability to create a demographics form is incredibly useful. And I've found in the past that there's sometimes a mismatch between recruitment panels and the criteria I set out and the people I actually end up with, because I think it's not really anyone's priority at the moment to update their recruitment panel settings and update their current life situation. So it's worth having that your own little survey to work with that. Now, then you have the task builder. Can the task builder do what I want? Does it have the features that I need? Are there specialist tools that I need, eye tracking or mouse tracking? Is there a special kind of paradigm that I'm looking at? What did other people use? I think these are all the important questions you need to ask yourself. And I think as well, do I need to do this in full code editor? Or maybe you want to say, can I do this in the code editor? Do I have the freedom to write something from scratch? Or is this something that I can get nice and easily built using a simple graphical user interface? These are the kind of questions you want to be asking about your experiment before you get started, before you choose an experimental platform. The things we're going to talk about today are a couple of new tools. There's the game builder, and we're going to talk about that today, which is absolutely incredible. And it's really, I think, going to change a lot of the way we do research. We have a wonderful game builder panel who are going to talk about the research they've been doing with games. And then we're going to get a wonderful demonstration from Nick, our CTO. Tomorrow, we've got, again, a great consumer decision-making panel talking about Shop Builder. And we're going to get a Shop Builder demo. And this is such a cool technique. It's such a cool tool for being able to do shopping-based research. Another question I think you want to ask yourself is, how well will I be supported in what I'm doing? Are there good forums out there? Are there YouTube videos? What kind of support documentation is there out there? What's the community like out there? These are things you'll want to be asking yourself. One of the things I love about Gorilla, and I work for Gorilla, this is what I'm familiar with. There are other tools out there that have equally great forums. I'll just say that out. But what I love about Gorilla from when I was a lecturer, before I even joined them, was the Collaborate tool, because it was another way of buying back my time. I was able to basically monitor my third-year project students and support them remotely, which meant at that time I was able to go to a conference in Paris rather than spending a couple of weeks in Egham. And Egham's lovely, don't get me wrong, but it's no Paris. And it meant I could go to this amazing conference in Paris and I could look at my laptop and I could check my emails and I could see if a student had an issue, a problem. I was able to support them remotely. I found that Collaborate function incredibly useful. It bought me back time. Same with the send function. The send function is so useful because in a lot of these different experiment platforms, you don't have to worry anymore about making all the system diagnostics kind of match up. So it's like, here's my task. Now, I am assuming that you're running a computer that is Windows 7 version 2.93-bit, it's 64-bit, it needs to be running MATLAB 2014b. And I think like a lot of people out there, I've got experiments that will only run in a very specific situation. If it's a Tuesday and the sun's just right, You don't have to worry about that stuff with a lot of online platforms because all the computing infrastructure is behind the scenes. You don't have to worry. So if you click send, they're going to get a working version of your experiment. And you don't have to spend time helping them to debug your experiment and get it up and running on their system. Finally, I love our open materials. It's such a great platform. It's a great place for researchers to disseminate their projects and a great place to share stimuli, which is so helpful rather than having to spend hours creating stimulus sets. In this one from Sarah Blakemore's group, this was a variation of the, what's it called, Raven's matrices task. And now that stimulus set is online and anyone can take it. You don't even need to ask permission. It's there held in a repository. You can just search for it and use it as you see fit. And there are a number of paradigms on Gorilla Open Materials, also other tools as well. There are lots of things out there in JSPsych, in Python, for example. There are loads of tools out there, loads of experiments already out there ready for you to download and use, which is just so helpful. Has your task been validated by others? And what did they use to validate it? Did they use, which platform did they use, basically? You can also ask just about the platform itself. Is there a paper that validates the platform? Or is that something that doesn't exist yet? And just finally, again, how easy is it to use this platform? These are some of the key things that you'll be wanting to ask yourself before getting started with your online experiments. So I'm going to talk now about some practical, concrete examples of different paradigms that I've seen online and ways that they've been able to, I think, bridge the gap, especially between lab-based and online research. Now, this is a really clever study. And what they were able to do here, they were able to create an Airbnb type situation. And I believe this was built in Task Builder using, there wasn't any code necessary. It was quite straightforward. It's images and different buttons. And what happens is when you want to see a piece of information, you'll click on the gold coin, and that means you're going to buy that content, essentially. It will unveil and reveal that content to you. And they went to do some really great research to look at, first of all, what kinds of information are people willing to pay for? They're able to say as well, how much do they spend? Versus they're able to say as well, like, how does that influence your information? How does that influence your decision-making processes? It's a really great study. It's worth having a look at this and right now. I think it's a wonderful experiment, very easily brought online. So I'm just going to go through an example now of how we can think about moving past traditional online studies. So for example, this was an experiment I built for Gorilla Academy, part of the learning section. Put that one on pause. And it's your classic psychology experiment. You've got two icons, a green and a blue one. You click on the right one, you'll see win. You click on the wrong one, then it tells you lose. And there's a little points update. It's not very catchy. I have to say that. It's exactly the kind of stuff that I built throughout my PhD and throughout my postdocs. It's your classic kind of psychology experiment. But I think we're getting to a place now where we can do something better, more sophisticated. And that's really what we're going to talk about a lot today with the Game Builder talks. If I just take this one back to the beginning now, this is the exact same experiment. But what we have here are we have cards. And when you choose the correct card, you see the star, you get the spins, and then what we call the particle effects, these sparkles. So we have all of these things, which are really great. And I can imagine doing 100 trials of this far more happily than I would 100 trials of the previous experiment. I think that's very important. If you want to make sure you get high data quality and you want to keep people engaged in your experiments, then it's important that we start thinking about these kinds of issues. How can I make my experiments more engaging? How can I make them more interesting and more fun to do? I'm reminded recently of looking at Sea Hero Quest that you may have heard about. Brilliant game. And it was from Professor Hugo Spears over at UCL. And what they did is they took a traditional paradigm called the Morris Water Maze, and they turned it into a really fun game where people explore worlds on jet skis. What they've been able to do with that game is incredible. They've had something like 4 million unique downloads, and I think they've collected data that adds up to, I think, 117 years of data. So I think that is incredibly impressive. And that's what you get with this kind of gamified research. You don't need to worry about paying as much for these participants. You create a game that is so naturally engaging. People want to do your experiment rather than you having to force people to do the experiment. It's something worth thinking about, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. Now, this is from a separate experiment. It's not the one that I've just spoken about. There was a different value-based decision-making study with similar parameters. And what we can see here is that there is quite a good degree of overlap between what they get from the lab and what they get with online research. And I think that, again, is nice to have these sanity checks. I stand by what I said beforehand. I don't think we should necessarily consider the lab to be the ground truth. But I think these kind of sanity checks are very helpful, and I think can really add confidence in what you're doing. I'm going to talk a little bit now about eye tracking. A lot of people, when they've gone online, want to do eye tracking research. And it's difficult. I'm not going to lie. I think it's an incredibly difficult thing to achieve. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And we ran something called Gorilla Presents, where we talked to a panel of experts about these problems. If you want to do eye tracking research or mouse tracking research, I highly recommend going onto our webpage and looking at this Gorilla Presents webinar. There's so many tips. It's a goldmine of information. I can't stress it enough. And actually, the data that we can see up in here, this is data from Jens's paper. He didn't use Gorilla. He used the WebGazer tool that Gorilla also uses. What he did is he did an eye tracking study in the lab, which you can see here in blue. And this is the horizontal gaze. So when someone looks left, there's a movement one direction. When someone looks right, there's a movement in another direction. And what we can see is that actually there's the very high degree of similarity between lab-based testing and at-home testing for eye tracking. There's obviously far more noise in at-home, but the actual general mean trajectories are incredibly similar. And in fact, there were correlations of 0.91 and 0.83. So very high correlations between lab-based testing and home testing. So it is possible to do eye tracking at home using web cameras. I should just say, though, it is incredibly difficult. Watch the Gorilla Presents webinar because it's going to have so many tips. It really was a gold mine. I think it had everything from shaving was a big thing. So try to get beardless people. I remember that was one of the big take-home messages from the talk. If you can, it's not always possible, but if you can, I would probably recommend mouse tracking over eye tracking. I think there are a lot of benefits to doing mouse tracking studies. Obviously, it's far more accurate than eye tracking on online computer-based testing. These are two examples that have used mouse tracking in different but very interesting ways. We can see here that, for example, in this top study, what they've done is they've used mouse clicks as a way of gauging attention. And the yellow-red heat maps are from where the people clicked. The white heat maps are computational models of salience. And you can see that essentially these two models are overlapping fantastically well. So what we can do is we can replace, rather than worrying about eye tracking, and you do lose a lot of data with eye tracking data, with mouse tracking, your attrition is far, far less. And you're getting what looks like very similar results, which is incredibly informative and I think incredibly just helpful to know. Now, this is from Jonathan Say's work, and what he did is he took a classic motor adaptation paradigm, one of these ones where you have a robotic arm. And that robotic arm, you basically create a kind of, you manipulate it so that even though I'm moving my arm directly forward in front of me, the image looks like it's moving out to the side. And this is the kind of work that's been done in motor control labs across the world for decades. Really great experiments. But what they can now do is they can take it online. And you can see when we look at the trajectories for in-person testing compared to online testing, we're getting the same shape function, both in person and online, which is, again, very reassuring. And as I mentioned earlier, this means that we can now do motor adaptation work with a whole new group of participants, people who, because of perhaps of their motor conditions, weren't able to get into the lab beforehand. We can now work with those individuals as well, which is incredibly rewarding. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up now and hopefully have a little bit of time if we want for some questions. We've talked about this idea of why should we go online? What are the benefits of online research? And I just remind you, speed, scale, reach. If anyone asks, those are the three things, three pillars why you should go online. We talked about the challenges. I think a lot of these aren't necessarily challenges, or they're certainly not challenges that are exclusive to online research. These are the same challenges everyone has in lab-based research. There are practical considerations before you get started. You'll need to pilot immensely. I can't stress that enough. You need to think about your experimental platform. Can it do what I need it to do? Does it have all the kind of ethics requirements that I need to do what I want to do? There are a lot of practical considerations to think about before you take your experiments online. And then finally, I've just given you a handful of examples there about what you can do with online research and the way that online research, in some cases, is replicate what we're doing in the lab. In other cases, is really just expanding and changing what we can do with research. So thank you ever so much for joining me today. I'm happy to take any kind of questions you might have, or if there's anything you're interested in asking right now.
Hi, Josh, there are a couple of questions coming through on the Q&A. Can I ask you those?
Yeah, absolutely. Please go ahead. Great.
So somebody's asked a very specific question, but I think it's an interesting one about the use of progress bars. Do you think there's any possibility that people might, that might actually have an influence on how, like, they start getting bored, or they go, no, I'm not, I've got ages to go, or I'm nearly at the end, I'm going to rush through. Do you know what I mean? Is there what's your feeling about the kind of, the utility of those?
Yeah, I think, that's a very good point. I think it probably could it could get people dropping out sooner. But I think in some ways that might be beneficial. I think it certainly is nicer from the participant's point of view. If the participant says, oh my God, I've been at this for ages and I've hardly scratched the surface, never mind. Or if a participant sometimes as well, if they have other commitments in their life, they know the postman's due to come around that sort of time, think, oh, I can't commit to this right now. I know I'm going to have to engage in something. I should drop out now. If it's still available later on, I can come back to it. In my opinion, it's beneficial. I think, the positives outweigh the negatives, in my opinion.
There's also just a question that's appeared in the chat. I would ask if you can put these in the Q&A, please do so. Are there any ethical issues around using eye tracking and mouse tracking online? Is there anything particular that we need to think about?
I don't believe so. Nothing that you wouldn't have with traditional experiments. I think with a lot of the eye tracking software, you don't have to worry because it doesn't actually encode, it doesn't capture any facial information. So there's no, with eye tracking in particular, what it tends to do is it creates a face model, which is just kind of a grid of where your face is. But it doesn't capture anything more than that. So there's no identifiable information that you need to worry about being sent to different people. So I don't think there are, in the tools themselves, I can't think of any ethical issues. How you use them, obviously, that changes the situation. I know we have some great, later on today, we're doing some sessions on eye tracking, on mouse view, actually, which is a wonderful alternative to eye tracking. And I know that a couple of those, they've got some, I think one of the talks is about using this in suicidal research. So obviously that when you use it in such a context, then there are the ethical issues. But the tool in itself, I think, is fine. I don't think there are any ethical issues to worry about.
And there's a very general question here from Nina, which is, when we decide to do an online research study, how can we be sure that the study will be reliable and valid?
I think that's a very big question. I think to be sure, I think certainty is quite difficult to come by. I think you obviously do the best that you can. Like I say, I think the best tips are things we've mentioned as well. Piloting is incredibly important, and that's going to tell you a lot of what you need to know. What I would also say is building on the back of other studies. I stand by, I hope I don't sound hypocritical, because I know I've said, and I do stand by what I said as well, that lab-based shouldn't be treated as necessarily being the ground truth. But obviously replication is fantastic. So taking tried and tested experiments that have been done, time after time, working with those kinds of paradigms and building up on those paradigms is a really great thing. So I think that's really one of the best things you can do. Look for those reliable paradigms that prove themselves, paradigms that have what I would call sanity checks in them, things that you know should happen.
I would completely agree with you on that. And I think it is and this would apply to lab-based science as well. This is just doing science. It is a good idea to have things built in that you should, if things are working, I should expect to see this result based on what we already know. I think just very briefly, going to your point about the ground truth, I think you're absolutely right. There's no baseline ground truth for lab-based stuff, but actually that's true across psychology. And I think one of the things that's quite useful to think about is you're never going to get to an answer if you just try one method. So, keep your focus broad. And if you have think about your research question, what are different ways you could address that question is also another important thing, because we don't have these ground truths. So having a broader perspective on it, I think, can really help. Enough from me, though. There's a question from Walter. Do you have any considerations regarding selection bias in online studies?
I think there's been some interesting stuff out there about different platforms. So I'm thinking there has been some research out there about Prolific versus MTurk and the individuals inside those platforms and how representative they are. I know Prolific has this really great feature now where I think you can actually have what they refer to as a representative population, which is quite a nice feature to try and make sure that you combat selection bias and you get something that is, you get the whole spectrum of individuals within your experiment, which I think is a wonderful idea. I don't think there are as many considerations, to be honest. I would hope that with these kind of tools, we're moving forward compared to lab-based research. And I think I can speak now to the lab-based work I've done in the past. And I know that they're quite homogeneous populations sometimes. So you can see from questionnaire data, looking at individual differences, that there aren't that many individual differences. You can see there's a very strong bell curve with quite a narrow precision to it. So I don't think there are as many considerations. My feeling is a little bit of intuition and kind of gut feeling is that we're just getting away from selection bias with online studies. Not completely, but it's a step in the right direction.
So something that my PhD student, Alexis McIntyre, has been looking at is variation in rhythm processing. And she's been using a rhythm processing task that she developed for several years. And you expect to get a wide range of performance on it. And when she moved her studies online last year, she found that scores on that went really high and much more narrow. And this is through Prolific, and when she filtered out for people who didn't play computer games, she found actually you saw something a lot more normal, but actually they also dropped down by an order of like 100-fold for the people who ended up in her study. So I think sometimes actually you might be picking, if there's a kind of if you have people who play a lot of computer games, and certainly her Prolific study, there were a lot of these people, they were doing really well.
Yeah.
If anything, slightly, and I think it doesn't take away from the results of the study, but it was interesting in terms of looking at individual variation where you would expect to see something broader. There were some interesting reasons as to why that was, and it's just worth bearing that in mind. There isn't going to be one truth for everything out there, and it is definitely worth bearing in mind. However, again, enough from me. Maybe we've got time for one more question. So there is a question about, and several points of this coming through, what happens if it's very difficult to make your study more interesting? And how can you, would that affect replication, but also if you can't make it more interesting, so would a more engaging study be more easily replicated, but also what should you do if you just can't make it more fun?
I think, unfortunately, I think that's a very difficult thing. I think you can make things more fun. I know we've got one of our speakers later on in the game session. He took the go, no go task, which is, to be honest, a boring study. It's not an interesting task, especially after a few repetitions. But he took that and he put a whole skin over it and turned it into this amazing game where you had avatars. And instead of just being, red circle, press, green circle, release, it became, a dragon, and you had to harvest gold to avoid the dragon. So I think there are a lot of really great creative solutions out there. And I think you can do a lot just by changing essentially the skin of it. So even if it's not creating a whole narrative, just making something that's visually more appealing can actually be really useful, I think. So I think there are a lot of opportunities to do that. I think if you really, really can't do that, then I think it's very difficult. I think you might end up just having to pay people. I think it's the only other option, external motivators.
Thank you.